It's time for Drummer Nation. Matt Brennan is an author, musician, and academic. He is currently an associate professor in popular music at the University of Glasgow. His newest book is Kick It, A Social History of the Drum Kit. In it, he addresses the seeming contradiction between the centrality of the drum kit on one hand and the general disparagement of drummers on the other. He examines the roles of artists and manufacturers against the dynamic backdrop of race relations, global migration, and the tensions between high and low culture.
I absolutely love playing drums, and I couldn't imagine not having that in my life. And I really, if I could help facilitate that and have an impact on your life so that you can play drums, that means the world to me.
Introducing the Star Festival snare drum from Gary Astridge, a handcrafted and precision replica of the rarest and most iconic of drums, Ringo Starr's 1963 Ludwig Jazz Festival. Each instrument is authorized and hand-signed by Ringo Starr and will benefit his charity, the Lotus Foundation.
Memphis Drum Shop is the world's premier provider of percussion instruments. With 6 showrooms of gear, mycymbal.com, the Memphis Gong Chamber, and a first-rate repair department, turn to Memphis Drum Shop for all your percussion needs. Matt Brennan, welcome to Drummer Nation, and thank you for doing my show. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for having me.
And where am I talking to you from?
I am currently in Glasgow, Scotland. I work up in the music department at the University of Glasgow, which is about a 15-minute walk from my flat where I'm staying under lockdown right now.
Yeah, we're all under lockdown here as well. So You did the education route. You have a PhD, I presume?
That's right, yeah.
And where a little background on you before we get to the book. Where'd you go to school?
I'm not originally from Scotland, as you might have guessed by now. So I was born in Canada, and I initially started out my education after high school pursuing a jazz drumming degree at McGill in Montreal. But it took me a couple years before I got a real hankering, actually, for a more liberal arts education. I was never one of those people in my degree or at any point in my life who was clearly always destined to be a star drummer, if that makes sense.
I sympathize.
Yeah.
I resemble that remark.
And I realized, I think, even trying to practice in quite a focused curriculum, kind of 6 hours woodshedding, every day, that try as I might, I might just about cut it, but it would always be quite a struggle to be a professional drummer. And at the same time, I noticed that, unlike some of my classmates, I had a real interest in writing and reading.
Mm-hmm. Well, that just means you have multi-talents. You're good in many things. Well, I like to say, as a drummer, I occasionally have delusions of adequacy.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So I suffer the same delusions.
I'm sure we're similar. I'm a good drummer. I've made a living my whole life. But a friend of mine says I'm a good vibraphone player, but I know Gary Burton.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I feel. I'm a pretty good drummer, but I know guys that are great drummers. So anyway, you came from that background, a drummer naturally, and an academic background. First of all, we're talking about your new book called, and I'll hold it up here, Kick It. There's been several names, but the one in the book says Kick It, A Social History of the Drum Kit, which I all but finished a few minutes ago, and I really love the book because it's right up my alley. A few distinctions I'd like to make up front that I remember from my historiography class and things like that. There are several types of, first of all, there's pop literature, and there's not academic, but scholarly research.
Yeah.
Let's say. This is the latter. And always, to me, you can tell right away if there's an index and notes in the back.
Yeah, that's right. A key distinction is citing one's sources. This is a very prized, currency in academia, where if you make a claim, you want to support it with evidence and a source of where you got it. So that is a key difference. Although, when I was writing it, you're right to point out that there are sort of two audiences. One is academic, but I did try my hardest to write it in a way that was not overly laden with jargon or,
Right.
academies or whatever.
Sure,
and so
I
hopefully,
didn't mean it to sound like it
yeah.
was a ponderous event.
Yeah, but some people make that immediate
Right.
association with academic writing.
Just
Yeah.
excruciating detail that just bogs down. No, it's not that at all. It's a very readable book. Now, the other type of histories I recall from my education is military political versus social cultural.
Yeah,
And
sure.
you say right in the topic, a social history of the drum set. Why don't you explain the difference to me, to our readers or listeners, between military, political, and social cultural?
Yeah, sure. So by putting that social history designation right in the title of the book, what I want to kind of alert readers to is that, say you have military political history on the one hand, there's a whole range of types of history. You could think of, say, a technical history of the drum kit, where I'm really exclusively focusing on the nuts and bolts. Or if we were thinking of a political history, how the state, intervenes or not in drum culture. That would be quite an interesting read. I'm not aware of a book that kind of takes that particular angle for the drums. But with social history, it's really about the place of the drum kit in society, and it's focusing on the people who give meaning to the drum kit. So that would be drummers, but also manufacturers, and also audiences, and also people who work with drummers. So other musicians and industries where drummers are embedded. How those people make sense of this instrument and how it functions in society, what its status is in society, and not just its status as an instrument, but also the status of the people who play it and the relationship between those two things.
Very, very good answer. I knew you'd have a keen understanding of that. Now, along those lines, you go through the whole history of the drum set, but prior to that, we had some things stacked against us from the get-go that you do a very good job of covering that go back for centuries. What are some of those?
Well, I think that drummers often suffered from this sort of systematic marginalization in status compared to other types of musician. And partly that's a result of drums being musical instruments that are of indefinite pitch. So unlike a piano or a trumpet, they don't easily adhere to playing out a chromatic scale. Although we could talk about how some drummers love to tune each drum to particular chords, and that there are pitch intervals that are very specific between them. But for most people, they don't think of the drum kit or percussion more broadly in those terms. And actually, particularly the instruments that make up the drum kit. So thinking of cymbals, drums, associated struck percussion, but not, for instance, say a marimba or timpani. Although at one point, say in the early 20th century, it wouldn't have been unusual to see a couple of timpani, hanging out behind a drummer. But for centuries, then these instruments sort of exist apart from the rest of the instruments of symphony orchestra. If we're going back to the 19th century or even earlier, they're strongly associated with music of the military. So you would often find these drums for centuries in Europe on the battlefield, and also the combination of large drums, which evolve into bass drums, snare drums or side drums, and cymbals. That combination is very much comes from a military connotation, but you wouldn't find them, say, in the realms of high art in the music of the court or patrons or the aristocracy. And that's something that's kind of embedded into the development of the drum kit as a distinct instrument. Those hierarchies were in place before the drum kit ever came together, I guess.
Well, exactly. Let's talk about that for a second, because another thing prejudiced against drummers is that it wasn't really an instrument that went back to antiquity. It was a collection of instruments. When I was teaching, I would ask kids, is this one instrument or is it a group of instruments? And, it's a trick question, of course, because it's both. But the drummer does his own mixing, or her, as they're playing, and makes this instrument sound like one thing. But that came together over a long period of time.
Yeah. Absolutely. I would say that, one comparison you can meaningfully make is that in 1800, well, you may have had a practice of, say, in military bands, snare drums and cymbals and large drums or bass drums, working collectively in combination. It usually wasn't one person playing all of those things simultaneously. Whereas by 1900, that was actually not so unusual. And although that's still quite early for us to be visualizing something that we might today recognize as a modern drum kit, you did often have one drummer playing a bass drum, often on the floor, a snare drum, and some collection of cymbals and other percussive traps around that. So what happens in those 100 years, right, to have this moment where it's clearly a collection of disparate, separate instruments played by multiple people to something that eventually coalesces into something that's played by one person? And I guess one of the arguments that I make in the book is that it's not an invention as an instrument that is necessarily super intentional. It's not like someone chose for aesthetic reasons to bring those different disparate percussion instruments together as a single hybrid instrument. It comes partly as a response to problems of labor on the one hand and space on the other. So, in the second half of the 19th century, when you have the development of variety shows, music hall, and also the working and middle classes kind of growing in strength and numbers to pay to go to these types of performances.
To afford entertainment, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of the birth of show business, right? Mm-hmm. And mass entertainment.
Well, one thing you make a good point of that I didn't realize, I think of the silent movies as employing a lot of piano players, but there were percussionists playing those movies as well.
A huge source of employment for drummers, absolutely. And
I didn't realize that. And there was something of Foley, what we now call Foley artists, as well as musicians. Now, there's also the discrimination of the instrument is not, a lot of faking went on, right? In fact, that's what brought it to the fore was these drummers. And you make a good point in the book that rather than perceive that as a lower order of contribution, it's actually higher because, you're inventing everything.
Yeah, that's right. This is something that was maybe not specific exclusively to drummers, but to jazz and ragtime culture more widely. So this notion where suddenly musical improvisation becomes highly prized as a skill, and those who might be purists in a kind of classical sense, where to be an excellent musician is to be able to have a high level of sight reading ability and be able to perform a score exactly as it is notated. Right. There is this kind of contrasting culture where actually being able to improvise, with or without a score is this new skill set. And it's not that those two are incompatible, as any jazz musician would know. They work very well together. But there was this tension that arose between these two types of literacy, these two skill sets in the early 20th century. And drummers really stood in as an example of that tension because the drum kit as an instrument really begins to take an identifiable shape at the turn of the 20th century. And so it's, even though, say, brass players are encountering that same tension between faking, as it was called, really that's
improvisation, we call it now,
for improvising, exactly, versus reading.
Quite a healthy challenge. It's not just BSing.
Exactly, yeah. So, where you might not immediately see that tension or be able to determine that was a divide when you're looking at a trumpet player, where a trumpet exists both in a classical orchestra and in a jazz context in the early 20th century. The drum kit is this new instrument, and it's heavily associated with ragtime, heavily associated with jazz, and not with many of those genres of music that came up earlier.
You make some other points that's associated with dance. And that's
absolutely.
not certainly anything that was allowed in the church, and another source of music to many people. But I think that still goes on to this day a little bit. I'll tell you a little story about me. When I was student teaching to finish a degree in essentially a history degree, secondary ed social studies, I was student teaching at a high school, and I met the band director. And I said, hey, I'm a drummer. I'd be happy to help you with the kids. It'd be my honor. And he said, well, keep in mind, I'd been a pro in LA for 10 years, right? I don't want to brag, but I'd made my living as a drummer my whole life, right?
Sure.
And he looked at me and he said, oh, you're one of those sit-down guys. And I knew in an instant he had dismissed me.
Yeah.
As being incapable of helping, an eighth grader learn to play a flam tap. So I didn't make a point of it, but
it's interesting the assumptions that people make. Oh yeah, it's really deeply embedded in musical culture. I think all of these assumptions. Yeah, it's and you find them maybe in vestigial form in 2020, but they're still there, absolutely, and they have a very long history, which is why they're so hard to get rid of completely.
Right. Now, like most stereotypes, preconceptions, now you spend a lot of time in the book. The beginning stuff is clever drummers putting this stuff together, noisy drummers, studious drummers, meaning, let's talk about some of the meanings that you invoke in each of those ideas. First of all, is it fair to say the drum set is a jazz baby?
Well, I think it depends on what sort of argument you're trying to make. That's, I think,
my
the
argument
way
is I want
most
your opinion.
people would describe it, and most people would say,
I'm sorry, it's hard not to talk over each other.
My opinion is that it's more complicated than that.
I want your opinion. So tell me, though. I'm interested.
My opinion is that you can actually have multiple arguments which are, all have a certain logic to them about where the drum kit and its origins lie. Jazz is one such origin story, but there are others. Right. It's absolutely clear, for instance, that when you kind of try to have a think about, okay, well, what is a drum kit? What is the bare minimum that we need in order to, say, rather than just being a collection of drums, it's something approaching a drum kit. For me, the bass drum pedal is an absolutely core component. I don't think you can really have something called a drum kit before you have something called a bass drum pedal. But when you start to use that as a core criteria, it becomes very clear that the bass drum pedal predates jazz considerably, like not by a couple years, but by many decades, right?
Right.
And so even though people aren't labeling, a drummer who's maybe using a bass drum pedal and playing a snare drum and a collection of other percussion with sticks as a drum kit or a drum kit player, to me, there's still a compelling case to be made that that's one legitimate possible point of origin.
I agree with that. We have a mutual friend, Daniel Glass, I believe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Daniel makes that point that there is no drum set without the development of the bass drum pedal. It's the single most important thing towards that development. Yeah.
And so if you take that as a point of origin, you could say that actually the bass drum pedal is something which you see sporadically, really you can find some isolated cases of it in the first half of the 19th century, but post-Civil War and particularly between 1880 and 1900, you begin to see patents and advertisements and it appearing in catalogs or photographs or descriptions of it. And those drummers are not playing jazz per se. They're in maybe what we might now recognize as musical theater or stage pit orchestras, things of that nature. Vaudeville, exactly. Sure. Different musical contexts. But that said, there's also a strong argument to be made that the drum kit as a distinct instrument certainly comes together in a very forceful way with the advent of jazz, because it's only in that genre of music that this really distinct performance practice starts to happen on the drum kit. So, say with drummers playing prior to, World War II, maybe with the exclusion of ragtime, you could say they're trying to imitate music that comes from a different context where a drum kit might or might not be present. And they're just trying to adapt it to, the trap drummer's outfit, as it would have been called then. Mm-hmm. But with jazz, suddenly you have this very strong relationship between the instrument and the performance practice of that instrument, right? Where it's very, very difficult to separate those two things after the 1920s. And so, I think there's also a case to be made. Well, is a drum kit, before you start playing it a certain way, or before you have, a real formidable artist like Baby Dodds to make sense of it, pull it together in a new way that makes us think, wow, this opens up possibilities for this collection of percussion that I hadn't previously even considered. That say someone like William F. Ludwig had not considered, even though he's absolutely vital in terms of the invention of the technology of the drum kit. He's not the one who invents a transformative performance practice on that kit. That's jazz drummers.
That's a good point. And that takes me where I was going, which is you spend a lot of time in talking about the early manufacturers of these instruments, because it wasn't until later that it was presented as a drum kit that you could buy in one swell foop, as they say. It was just stuff people put together. But along those lines, I read a great story in your book I didn't know. I related it on my Facebook page earlier this week. It's timely because you and I are sitting here in isolation during the coronavirus, for people who are watching this many years later, by the millions.
That's right.
And the story is of William F. Ludwig, who had a business, Ludwig and Ludwig, with his brother, Theobald, I think it was.
Yep, exactly.
And they had a patent in 1909 on the bass drum pedal and had a little business going. Meanwhile, William F. had secured the bass drum chair in the Chicago Symphony. And his brother passed away due to the flu epidemic of 2017, 2018, where so many people died, right? And William had to decide if he was going to be principally a musician or a manufacturer, and he made the case to leave that gig and to work with the company, and so the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, it's interesting to sort of think back to that era of the Spanish flu, almost or just over 100 years ago, I guess, and think about like what was happening to music. In kind of the most comparable pandemic that we can think of in the past couple of centuries, really. And another really interesting development is that there was a real concern in the 1910s that one thing that was spreading these viruses, which were much less understood in that era, was mosquitoes and flies. And so you have a lot of patents for fly swatters. One of the most successful of which, of course, becomes what we now think of as brushes.
Right.
And those become highly imitated. Ludwig starts putting out they're called something like Cinco Jazz sticks or something like that. But we definitely recognize them as brushes for the kit. And those were the original kind of telescoping design where you kind of have this. Sort of rubberized connection that you then pull down, and there's a spread of metal fibers. A perfect example. It's like we planned it.
Maybe we're drummers, it just so happens.
Exactly. That's a design that comes from a response to pandemic and contagion.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
How that works. Well, let's look at some of these chapters and just blow through a little bit about each one. Like, what would you like us to know about studious drummers, selling drum outfits, standardization, and stardom?
Yeah. It was interesting trying to come up with a structure for the book, I guess.
I like the structure.
Oh, thank you. You sort of alluded to it. So I've got these different themes of clever drummers, noisy drummers, studious drummers.
Let's go through those a little bit.
Yeah,
sure. I read the whole book, but I want you to maybe summarize what each of these are about.
Yeah, sure thing. So one stereotype about the drum kit and drummers that I faced was that it wasn't a serious instrument, I guess. And this is something that, is applied more broadly to popular music versus classical repertoire, right?
Sure,
The
yeah.
serious stuff, legit stuff on the one hand versus, a kind of high-low divide, which of course, the boundaries between that have changed over the century, whereas jazz in the early 20th century was maybe paradigmatic of low art and dismissed as such. It's
Right.
now fully institutionalized, fully considered America's classical music, to quote Ellington or
Yeah,
whatever.
It's haute couture now.
Yeah. So in the 1930s, that shift hadn't happened yet. And the drum kit kind of stood in as this modern instrument for music that was played by fakers, music that was lowbrow, music that did not require significant amounts of practice. Now, none of those things were true, but those were views held by, say, a good number of music critics writing at that time. And so I wanted to say, actually, obviously, to the audience who will be watching this interview, the drum kit is an object worthy of serious study. But where does that practice of study really start to coalesce and gain traction? And to me, it's in the 1920s and the 1930s, where you have this recognition, certainly by musicians, that jazz actually is pretty hard. And so a response, and yet people want to know how to do it. So you have this interesting emergence in the late 1920s of method books and instruction manuals, and really the first sort of print literature of the drum kit, saying, not that any of it was all that convincing, I have to add, but there is at least a kind of, there's a lot of evidence of attempts to say, okay, here's how you should learn this thing. We recognize that it's not obvious, that people want to learn it. And that's where you first start to have this literature about the drum kit, and also schools. The drum kit is obviously, maybe not obviously, but this wasn't always something you could study in university, right?
Right, of course, right.
Right? It would have been seen as the furthest thing from that. They wouldn't let that instrument in the place and into conservatoires.
Well, if you go to high school bands today, most of them have no drum set. I mean, it's really not a high school band instrument.
Yeah. So there you go. Further evidence of that legacy, or the remnants of it. But at the same time, due to the popularity of that instrument, due to the fact that it was a complicated instrument to master, and there was this culture of virtuosos that people wanted to emulate, so not just your Baby Dodds, but your Gene Krupas and whoever else. You also started to have schools appear and significant teachers. So Sanford Moeller might be one such teacher. This is the same time that the National Association of Rudimental Drummers starts to come into play. I think that's founded in 1933 or 34.
I'm not sure, something like that. George Lawrence Stone.
Yeah,
Stone
exactly. So George Lawrence Stone's stick control book. Roy C. Knapp and his famous school, where he taught Krupa, but also drummers like Hal Blaine and many others. It was based in Chicago, and well represented in publications like, say, Downbeat magazine. So we think of now Downbeat being maybe this magazine that's always existed. That was also a mid-1930s development, and some of its first advertisers are these percussion schools like Roy Knapp. So all of that. Kind of nascent literature really begins to appear and take shape in the 1930s. And so I consider that to be a useful historical moment to really explore what it means to study the drums. So the book is kind of structured thematically on the one hand, as you talked about, chapter 1, clever drummers, chapter 2, noisy drummers. But what I'm trying to do with that is to say there are these different stereotypes about drummers, and each of them, they kind of exist over the long view of history. They are maybe best explored in a certain era that has a kind of gravitational pull. So you can kind of tell this story that according to different themes, but it also sort of moves along vaguely chronologically as well.
Right.
That was my attempt anyway.
Well, nicely done. And let's move chronologically a little further on. Studious drummers, this was what you touched upon, the idea that there's a pedagogy here. And
yeah.
There is something serious to, I mean, any drummer who's tried to approach any style of music realizes pretty quickly that there's some serious work to be done to master that. And you talk about the beginning of the backbeat. And how like in the late 50s it all sort of changed.
Yeah, certainly it changed over to the drum kit. The backbeat is something, it's a musical element that you can hear played maybe not on the drum kit, but say in the Sanctified Church in pre-World War II.
That's what I first thought of, the Sanctified Church with the sorry, I got to get something off my screen here. With the tambourine, especially.
Exactly, yeah. Or, hand claps and gospel and all kinds of religious music. Or indeed in sections of jazz music from, say, the big band era where maybe that backbeat isn't occurring throughout a whole song, but it's that kind of let her rip moment where suddenly, Carnegie Hall, 1938 with Benny Goodman and Krupa, you hear some pretty heavy backbeat in moments of that.
Shout chorus stuff, yeah.
Exactly.
Have you ever had a band leader say, chop wood, baby, chop wood? There's a thing where Steve Gadd is playing with Quincy Jones on a Sinatra album, and Quincy gives him those directions at some point. He says, chop wood there.
Okay.
And we all know what that means, man. That's 2 and 4.
Exactly.
That's chop wood, baby. It moves the music forward, but it became the dominant style of drumming.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's very much a post-war development. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you do a good job. I'm sorry, because it's hard when two countries not to talk over each other. Yeah. I think you do a good job of showing the attitude of jazz players who had looked at it as a highly nuanced, highly sophisticated art form. And then the rock cats came and they were nailing 2 and 4. And it was put down at first because, well, that's nothing, man. Like guys who came up listening to Buddy and Gene, and Ringo comes on all of a sudden. It took a lot of jazz players a while to get that, to say, well, that's a whole different set of rules, that's a different discipline, and it's no better or worse than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you see that tension within a single person as well. Like I find Charlie Watts a really fascinating character for that reason, right? Because he like so many drummers of his generation, there were no rock drummers for him to listen to. He would listen to DJ Fontana, sure, right. But his idols were jazz players, as were like Keith Moon and John Bonham and all those people that we think of as like the real pioneering hard rock drummers. They were listening to Krupa and Buddy Rich,
and the Motown guys were all over. They did jazz dates at night.
Yeah. So someone like Charlie Watts, and this is another characteristic I think of drummers, is that they're often very self-deprecating. And of course we would say that, but Watts certainly is, and he consistently kind of downplays his own contribution to drum culture. But I think that's because this tension that you talk about, where jazz players are looking at rock drummer and not quite, and basically trying to judge rock drumming against jazz criteria, which at a certain point become the wrong criteria.
Right. Yeah, you really can't do that with anything, right?
Yeah. So Watts, I've always felt, at least from the interviews that I've read by him, he judges himself against jazz criteria when he shouldn't.
Right. No, he's great in the Rolling Stones, and that's his gig. Doesn't matter how that compares to what Buddy did in Channel One,
And lots of drummers tried to imitate him.
Of course.
What Charlie did. Yeah.
How many people leave out the hi-hat when they play 2 and 4 on the snare drum, because that's how Charlie did it?
Yeah.
And he probably did it because he didn't know any different, or it's he put the music first. There's an art to that. You cover that too. I think you do a great job of covering. Now, do you know, one of the things, I used to have a cymbal business, and I felt lucky that I got to know a lot of these industry people. You do cover some of those cats too, But I felt privileged that I got to know Robert Zildjian, Remo Belli, Roy Burns, Johnny Craviotto, all of those cats that were still around in my lifetime.
Sure.
They are really forces behind the industry, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And what's most interesting to me, I think, are where those two worlds come together, you know, where people working in the manufacturing business or the design field of these companies, where they come together with drummers who are out there in the clubs, and something happens, this really interesting moment where they have a conversation, and suddenly an idea is hatched. Drummers will say, you know what, we really need ride cymbals to be bigger or thinner.
I was hoping you would go there, because my experience has been in the cymbal industry. One of the great points you make about Zildjian and Avidus and going way back is, that Turkish old cymbals were not necessarily what these drummers wanted. They were big and heavy and cantankerous. They were made for going back to metal music, from the early centuries ago, from Turkish marching bands, basically. And it was the guys at Zildjian talking to the Gene Krupas of the day and saying, what do you need, man? And that way it went full circle, so that they're not just throwing out product and drummers are playing whatever they could get. They started to define what was being made: ride cymbals, crash cymbals, splash cymbals, so forth.
And there's such a back and forth between those two cultures, it's I find that super fascinating, that it takes those conversations between Avidus Zildjian and, Gene Krupa, Chick Webb, other drummers working in the 1930s to say, actually, the music is sort of demanding this type of cymbal that doesn't exist, but if you could make one, then
to me,
that would be great.
That's more fascinating than the creation story of 1620 something and what a sultan said. That I don't really care about that. I care about the part where the industry listens to the artist and it drives the music. And I had a part of that when I had my company. We had cymbals we made through artists. Stanton Moore came up with some stuff. I said, how did you know how that would sound? Big potholes in a cymbal, or different lathing on the top or bottom, or Jeff Hamilton, or some of these guys we did cymbal designs with.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big deal. That's not an easy task.
100%. And it's all part of the same culture. And I think what I was hoping to do, I guess, with this book is to kind of look at that culture in its totality. So it's not a book about the canonical, list of famous drummers and a discussion of how great they are. There's some of that, but it's trying to look at the broader picture, how people playing that instrument, interact with people making the instrument or teaching the instrument, or the relationship between amateurs and professionals, for that matter. All of these things inform this very rich culture, which allows that instrument and its performance to unfold the way it did. You can't take out any one of those elements, otherwise you'd have a different trajectory, a different story.
Exactly, and it's in the blurb on the back of the book. Tackling the history of race relations, global migration, and the changing tension between high and low culture, Kick It shows how the drum kit and drummers help change modern music and society from the bottom up. So, I mean, you do a great job of give the drummer some,
Oh, thanks, man.
Because one point, and then I think we should wrap up, is you point out that there's no credit that goes to those kind of things in terms of royalties or copyrights, or you have lyrics, you have melody, you have chord structure. You can't really chord structures are not something you can copyright, and arrangements are not something you can copyright. So the drummers were left out of all of the ownership of that stuff.
Yeah. There's definitely an interesting way in which we can kind of interrogate what we consider to be valuable in music by looking at the least powerful, members of that musical community. And for a long time, drummers were at the bottom of that hierarchy. I think that that's slowly changed over the past century. And
I hope so. But even Clyde Stubblefield, his funky drummer, right, was like the most sampled thing in the world. But if you want to use something like that and you want to do it right and you want to pay the licensing on it, Clyde never got any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. He's sort of the great cautionary tale, I guess, of how slow that pace of change has been.
Mm-hmm. Anything we haven't covered you want to throw in?
Well, just to
there's
say,
plenty more in the book we haven't covered. I just meant, is there a major conceptual point that we're not addressing?
No, I mean, as you say, there's lots of material in the book. It took me 10 years to write, so it's been a kind of long time labor of love. But I guess just to say thanks for engaging with it, because in the current situation, the book came out a month ago, and I had some talks and and launches that I was excited to get into. Had been invited to get to the Chicago Drum Show by Rob Cook to give a wee presentation there, and obviously due to the coronavirus situation, that's all been canceled.
That's a great show, by the way. Have you been to it before?
Just once before, yeah.
And, great show. I really recommend it to everyone when the world gets back to normal.
So, yeah, I was a little disheartened, and obviously, feel very lucky to have my health and everything, and not be a frontline worker. So super lucky in many respects, but I was a little saddened that these plans I had for the book weren't going to be able to materialize. So any moments like this where I find the book connecting with people despite the pandemic makes me very happy, and it's a real antidote to feelings of gloom.
One point I'd like to leave it on is that you don't have to be a drummer to dig this book, man, because it is a social history of the drum set. By the way, why picture of art on the cover? What prompted that selection?
Oh,
is that a publisher thing, or did you come up with it?
No, that was my choice. Obviously, I love Art Blakey. It's hard to pick a favorite drummer, but this is definitely maybe my favorite photograph of a drummer.
Oh, it's a great shot. I would have.
And there's something about it with the drum kit sort of taking up most of the frame, but kind of being out of focus, and what you're really focused on is the person behind it. To me, that seemed like a nice pictorial metaphor for what I'm trying to do inside the book.
Indeed, and I like the joy that's coming through here, the joy and the sense of intensity that was Art Blakey, the volcano,
Yeah.
All right, brother. Well, I appreciate what you do, and you're full-time living over in UK now?
Yeah, I'm a full-time member of staff at the University of Glasgow.
Okay. We'll put some links up in the show notes, and I sure appreciate you doing this. And one of these days we'll be in the same place at one of these conventions or something, and we'll have a taste.
That would be great. It's been a pleasure.
All right, brother. Thank you for your time, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, sounds good. See you now.